This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. Hello and welcome to the show. This is your host, Georgina Rose, and welcome back to another episode. In this episode, I have a lovely guest. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I am Steven Dillon. I'm a pagan philosopher and author. I've written a couple books. My most recent one is the one I'm hoping makes a splash, but it's Pagan Portals, Polytheism, a Platonic Approach. I've written a couple journal articles as well. I've ran a couple blogs. I'm not a philosopher by profession. I'm actually in the army. But I am hoping one day to do this professionally. But I'm obsessed with it. I've been doing this for over 10 years now, and it's definitely my passion in life.
Perfect. What we're mostly going to be talking about in this episode is that idea of Platonic polytheism. I read his book. It was quite interesting. I would recommend it. I think I posted it to Twitter when it came out, but it was genuinely a cool read. I've noticed online there's this massive increase in people who are talking about Platonism and polytheism. I've had a number of them on this show in the past, and I think that it's something that is kind of making an impression, making a dent. I see it rising a little bit, which I always find quite interesting. But I guess I should ask the really basic question first, right? The 101, the groundwork question. So, how would you explain Platonism to the absolute novice?
Philosophy was done differently in ancient times than it is today. Today, it's very much a science. It's very mathematical. It's very analytic. But in ancient times, philosophy was done through your lifestyle. And that is what Platonism is. That's where it came from. And throughout all of its reoccurrences throughout history to its modern ones now, it's a lifestyle more than anything. But it's an entire worldview. And the core of it is the thoughts of Plato, essentially, who designed this worldview around questioning the one and the many, we might say. I mean, there's a million ways to put this, but Platonists are very focused on the one and the many. They notice that there are one things. There's pencils, there's trees, there's rocks, there's raindrops, there's blades of grass, there's all these one things. But then there's many of these one things. And so they, as strange as it might sound, they were able to hone in on these two universal features and they deduced an entire worldview around the properties of oneness and manyness, and that's the essence of Platonism. That question, but it is also in its full manifestation the school of thought that matured throughout the centuries. It's very religious because in its quest to understand oneness and manyness, the Platonists discovered that the gods played an essential role in explaining all of it. They found that they had to posit these, what they would call supra essential individuals to account for anything at all. And so it's very difficult to explain this from ground zero, but I would say on the one hand that it's a lifestyle of trying to embody these ideas. And on the other hand, the ideas that you're trying to embody have to do with the gods and the unity that you see throughout nature, and as well as the plurality. I don't know if that did anything.
No, I think that does make sense. I like your point about the lifestyle because I think sometimes in the modern mind, I think we have a tendency to really sort of isolate things and put them into categories. We really like to make everything into clean little categories and forget that all this stuff sort of blends together, right? Like your philosophy should be inspiring your lifestyle and that should all connect. What are some ways in which someone can live kind of a platonic life, so to speak?
So, just going back to that, the idea that in ancient times philosophy was lived, the idea is like, okay, so you have these ideas about how the world works, but is this livable? Is this something that you can actually live out? So you would have like these hyper skeptics, for example, who they were so impressed by their uncertainty, for example, that they would try to live that skepticism out. And very often it was pointed out like your philosophy is not livable, because at the end of the day, you may say that you're skeptical of this, that, or the other, but you're still out there eating. You're still out there sleeping. You're still out there looking for shelter. So, no matter how abstract things got in the schools back then, the question is always, is this livable? And for the Platonist, the life that you're living is to embrace your unity. So I've been kind of dancing around unity because it is a very philosophical concept, but it's also so abstract because it's too close to see. So maybe if I could just take a few minutes to delve into that, I could get into
Oh,
how
I
we
would
would.
love that. Can you?
Mhm. So um, let's see. The Platonists noticed, I guess, along with all of us, but they really noticed that everything is itself. Everything is one numerically individuated thing. Above all else, it may also be a tree. It may also be a person. It may also be a dog. It may also be this, that, or the other. But at the end of the day, there is an it. There's a self. There's a unity. There's an integrity of being itself. And this isn't just for what you might think of as objects or substances, but even concepts and more abstract entities. Everything, absolutely everything, is itself. And so they were very impressed by this feature of reality, that everything is one thing. Um, and so, in trying to account for what unity is, um, they kind of got into the ineffable. I'm trying to avoid some of these terms that the audience may not be familiar with, but ineffability is a big um, part of the vocabulary in Platonism. Ineffability, unity. When you look at something in and of itself, there's nothing else to describe it by other than itself. So it's in a way indescribable. It's ineffable. Um, to help with that, by analogy, you might think of a statement, and this is something I go into with my book. Propositions, statements, sentences. They're made up of a subject and a predicate. And the predicate is what describes the subject. It's what um, informs you about the subject. But the subject itself is not a description. It's not describable. So the subject qua subject is ineffable. And they thought this about everything. When you peeled back all the layers of their material composition, of the species they belong to, of the roles they play, of their relations, when you peel back everything, you get this fundamental unity, this subject qua subject that's ineffable. And so, going back to how do you live this kind of philosophy out, they believe that each of us is utterly unique at our core. That's who we are. It's not what we are, it's who we are. And so, living out Platonism was all about knowing yourself as the oh, my mind is blanking right now. But as it was said in ancient times, know thyself. That was the prime rule, and that idea of coming to know who you are was essential in Platonism then as it is now. And coming to know who you are is more than um, learning facts about where you came from, about how you were brought up in life, about your political beliefs, about all these things. It's about knowing your ineffability in and of yourself, who you are. Everything else is a manifestation of that, of who you are, your psychology, your biology, your um, habits, your vices, your virtues, all these things are reflections of what's going on inside. And so, um, as a very long-winded way of answering that, I would say the Platonist lives out their philosophy by appreciating uniqueness, not only in others, but in themselves, and using that as their moral compass, so to speak.
Yeah, I feel as if learning who oneself is actually very complicated. And it's one of these things that no matter what tradition you come from, no matter what path you're part of, it's one of those big journeys that I think people take alongside discovering spirituality because the self is actually very, very complicated. And I think it really links to a lot of these things beyond the self that people are trying to understand and make sense of when they explore spirituality. This idea of ineffability is really interesting to me. It makes me think that Platonism, and I could be wrong here, correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of a worldview where it has that connectedness. Does it sort of lead into like a everything is connected type modal of thinking, or no, am I wrong?
Oh, yes, very much so. The Platonists had this view of reality as a whole. So they didn't examine nature like we do now, in bits and pieces and under microscopes and isolated. Everything was connected. In fact, to go back to what I was hinting at, they placed unity as their focus philosophically and even morally. Um, but it wasn't just your unity or my unity. They accounted for unity as such by positing um, these divine individuals who are completely, utterly unique. They're utterly ineffable. They don't have, um, let's say, bodies like you and I. They don't have nationalities. They don't have all these properties that explain them. They're just completely and utterly themselves, and they function like forms of being. So you might think of like solidity. The concept of solidity explains solid things, and liquidity explains liquid things. Their utter unique self, their character, function like a form that everything participated in, and that's how everything gets its unity. That's how it gets its self. They're like the capital S self for all selves. And so they saw all things as connected in this all-encompassing whole. They actually called it the all, and that's one of the latter, more mature ways of talking about the gods you'll find in the Platonists, like in Damascus. He would talk about the gods as the all. Um, they encompass all things in themselves, like a form of being encompasses all of its instantiations, for example. So yes, very much they thought of nature as interconnected.
Yeah, so if the gods are the all, does that mean that Platonism, when it discusses the various gods, sort of leads to a conclusion similar to like pantheism or soft polytheism or monism or something like that?
Oh, so this gets really interesting. I feel like a lot of times modern historians, especially and theorists of religion, will read ancient thinkers and they'll see pantheism, for example, because ancient thinkers will talk about how a god is everything. And I feel like the Platonists use that language in a more, I would say, in a more profound way. They don't simply mean like a god is the mind and the world is the body, and they don't mean like everything just is God. For example, like Spinoza would say, like I'm like an atom in God's body or something like that. They would say that everything is its own unique self. Like I'm real. I'm not an illusion. But I am an instance, an example of a form of being, you might say, and that form of being is what gives me my selfness, my uniqueness, my unity. And so that could be all things insofar as they change, for example. You might say that's Poseidon. That's something that the Platonists would say. Poseidon, his unique character is manifested through change. So all things, insofar as they change, they're participants of Poseidon. And you might say Zeus is stability. That's how he manifests. So all things, insofar as they are stable, they're participants of Zeus. Um, I don't know if that helped at all, but it's not so much pantheism, but it does involve that radical immanence, I guess.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I do think that sometimes pantheism does people think that all things that are connected are pantheism, and that it's a lot more complicated than that. It really is kind of reminding me actually of an idea that the Hermetic types think of called emanationism, which is basically this theological position where so everything is an emanation out from an original like point in the circle, right? Like there's a point and all the divine is emanating out through these spheres and it's expressing itself as different gods. And so all these gods are sort of they're faces of this one initial point, but they're emanating out. So there is a separateness to them even as they go out. And then this emanation out goes so far that we are sort of a little bit like we are the lowest level of that emanation. It all circles back. So while it's like unified, it's still in separate forms. I don't know if it's the same thing, but it reminds me more of that emanation idea than, say, the traditional like pantheism, the universe is everything type idea.
Yeah, absolutely. You just made me think of this whole the way of Platonists would talk about the structure of reality. They talked about emanationism, how all things emanate from the gods. They talked about the procession of being, for example. And I feel like to modern ears, when we hear that, we think of like a temporal process. We think of successive events. We think of like a timeline. But really, what they were talking about is like looking at the all and stratifying it. They were seeing different layers in a sphere, for example. So they weren't necessarily talking about a process, although process is one of the layers. But really, what they were doing was, yeah, stratifying the all. And they say like from the center, that unity, then you get being, and then you get life, and then you get intellect, and then you get material realm, and like you were saying, we're kind of at the bottom, the most outer, most realm, for example. But yeah, I wonder how related emanation is to the procession of being. It sounds really interesting.
I would guess there's probably a connection because I hear the emanation term. It's thrown around a lot in like neo Hermeticism, which I know does have like a strong Platonic influence on it. If you look further back, it's a more modern idea. Like Platonism is much, much older. So there probably is like, I would say, an influence just like historical. Because I know Neoplatonism, which I talked to other Platonists who told me that there's not much of a distinction between Neoplatonism and Old Platonism. It's just like a time thing. Um, is a big influence. So I would guess they probably relate in some way. I remember once you were mentioning the circle. I once saw a diagram of like I don't know if it was parts of the soul or like the universe. It was one of those like big metaphysical diagrams that people draw to try to show the meaning of everything. And it was a circle with layers. And I remember looking at it and I was like, this is a really and it was a redraw of something that had been drawn in a different type of chart. And I was like, this makes it make sense in a very different way. I think like we tend to really you're right. We put things through lenses of time because I think our perception as humans is fundamentally kind of limited. We're always going to filter these really abstract ideas through something we understand so that we can even grasp them without going absolutely insane. Um, I think that's just something we're gonna keep doing. You mentioned that we're sort of like the lowest level. Does Platonism argue that there's sort of a divine spark in us, or is it like we're just a reflection of it? Like, are we divine in this system? Because I know that's a big debate that different systems say yes to, and some systems say absolutely not. That's completely wrong. So, where does Platonism stand on that sort of discourse?
Yeah, so I think a more widespread impression of Platonism is that either that it's anti-material, or that a big part of it was anti-material, and it was a divided school. And this is due to Plotinus. I've always pronounced his name Plotinus, but I don't speak Greek. But he seems to write about how matter is evil, and this is it's a very technical argument on his part, and it's a very clever argument, to be honest. But when we hear matter and we hear evil, I think it's easy to just think like he's talking like rocks and leaves, and this is evil, for example. So you did have this huge Platonic thinker that was using that kind of language, and it gave a really bad impression to a school that was already, I feel, severely misinterpreted through monotheistic lenses and and read through theologies that were not charitable to Platonism. But all that aside, the way I would approach it is like this. Proclus, one of the most um, advanced and prolific Platonic thinkers, he once said that um, everyone who talks about gods, what they're talking about is what is first by nature. And what he means is like what precedes everything else. And he was like, for some people, that's the body. And so for them, the gods are a kind of body. And he's like, for other people, soul is what comes first. And so for them, the gods are a kind of soul. For others, it's intellect. And then he goes on through this list and he goes, for Plato, it was unity. And so going back to what I was saying earlier, how the Platonists were so impressed by unity and uniqueness, individuality, we don't really have a good English term that encapsulates that Greek henos, unity. But unity is what comes first. That is what the divine is. It's that selfness, and that is omnipresent. All things, I mean, absolutely everything has some degree of identity. Even being itself, even things that don't you would say really exist, like fictional characters and concepts. They all have identity. So I would say, insofar as and to the extent that you have unity and identity, you are participating in divinity. Um, we are very privileged in the cosmic spectrum, in a sense, because even though the Platonists would say we are on the end of the procession of being, we're in the very outermost reaches of the material realm, we participate in divinity in a very unique way because we're so fragile and we're so delicate. One minute we're here and the next we're not. Life is so short. And due to that, I think you'll find Platonists using this interesting language like we are precious in the eyes of gods because we're not always here. And so I think we do participate in divinity on the one hand, and we do so in a very beautiful way, I would say.
It's interesting. This idea of like ideas even having like a divinity to them, it makes me think a lot of the sort of modern Western ideas, particularly in like the occult world of egregores and thought forms, which is kind of this idea that like thoughts, ideas, when they conglomerate, they sort of become an intelligence of their own eventually. It reminds me of that, like the idea that you can sort of speak and think an idea into existence, and even if it's not existing on this material plane, it's still somewhat there. Is it kind of paralleling that, or am I way off the field?
I would say it wouldn't directly imply that. It's more or less just saying that divinity is unity. So, insofar as anything has unity, it's participating in divinity. But I would also say that the Platonic idea of life is really interesting. Like life um, finds a way; it will break laws to exist. You know what I mean? So, like, I guess what I'm saying is, if concepts can somehow take on forms of life, there just will find a way for that to happen.
Absolutely. So your idea about it, the materialism thing we were discussing a little earlier, I when I've looked at Platonists and when I've discussed them, it seems not, I wouldn't say anti-material in the same way, because when I think of like really extreme anti-material ideas, my brain goes like to Gnosticism, which
Mhm.
Gnosticism I feel like is the most extreme anti-material philosophy out there, right? Saying that everything material was created by evil, is inherently evil, and that the only way to have anything good and divine is to break past the material. So that makes me wonder, does Platonism give a moral judgment to material versus non-material things in that kind of way, or no? Because it seems like it's much less black and white about this compared to something like Gnosticism, which is objectively anti-material.
Yeah, it is, and it's interesting that Plotinus, however you pronounce him, he wrote a whole treatise against the Gnostics. So Platonism was um, radically opposed to Gnosticism, especially in this element. You won't actually find a lot of Platonists talking about morality. You'll find the occasional treatise, but Platonists didn't really focus on that. For them, morality was all about becoming like gods. It was just theosis. That's all it really came down to, and there wasn't much that needed to be said on that. But um, implicitly, what you see is Platonism gravitating very heavily toward incorporating material things in their practices, like theurgy, for example, God work, statues, candles, incense, everything. All these things are symbolic of the gods, and they're good and they're beautiful. And so I would say that far from being anti material, um, Platonism, I would say, is very pro um, matter in a way, while at the same time acknowledging that the cycle of reincarnation uh, includes this part of our life as a falling away from the gods. And so that's a lot to unpack, but I would say ultimately the view is that matter is very good and it's beautiful. It's a necessary part of things. And that part, for us at least, is just a declining away from the gods.
That makes a lot of sense. Does that sort of imply, and this is a discourse that modern paganism has a lot, that the gods are sort of inherently good?
So this is a really interesting topic. The Platonists are very clear that the one, or what you might say oneness, is the good. It is goodness. So they identified unity and goodness. And so insofar as the gods are pure individuals, they are pure good, right? So when you hear that, you think, well, okay, the gods are perfectly benevolent. They are all good. We start gravitating toward this terminology um, that's more widespread from the monotheist influences, because that's a big focus, especially in like today's philosophy of religion. Is God all loving? Is God all this? Is he all that? For the Platonists, they were making more of a um, I guess you might say, a metaphysical point. It's not so much that the content of a God's goodness is, you might say, um, like love or something like that, but they would say that insofar as a God is the all, insofar as her unique character encapsulates all things in a certain way, she takes care of all things in that respect. But that doesn't mean that her respect is, you might say, enjoyable from another respect. What's good for the predator isn't good for the prey. So you have, for example, I think it's the Iliad. It says that of all the gods, Zeus hated Ares the most. And from a Platonic perspective, we might say, well, that makes sense because Zeus is reflected throughout nature in stability, but Aries is reflected throughout nature as division, and stability and division are opposed. Even though all things, insofar as they are divided, they have a goodness to them in that respect. But when you juxtapose the two, it's like incompatible goods, you might say. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. The monotheist influence is actually something I really wanted to explore with you because a lot of Platonist discussions and a lot of the way that people discuss Platonism today is through this very monotheistic lens. I know in particular Christian theologians were very interested in Platonism, and a lot of them sort of brought Platonism in, which is interesting because Platonism, I think, pretty clearly originated from polytheistic ideas. I mean, objectively, historically, it did, but I was wondering, how do you feel about, or what do you think? I guess the better question is, how do you think Platonism was changed by it being filtered through this very monotheistic lens, and what did that sort of lead to?
Okay. So I think that um, I feel like ideologies war with each other by trying to see who can include the other one while remaining the same, if that makes sense. So, um, for example, Platonism and Stoicism, they won at one time, and Platonism obviously won out. Stoicism died out. And the way it worked was the Platonists were like, I think you're right, but that doesn't change what I'm saying. So, like, my ideas are actually bigger than yours, but you're right, for example. So, Christianity and Platonism did this in a manner of speaking, but I feel like the Platonists didn't have the means to get their ideas out there. In fact, they lost ground very quickly, and their academies were closed. They were censored. Olympiodorus, for example, one of the last Platonists, was a teacher, and his students were Christian, and he had to be very careful about what he said. So, in that war, I feel like it was won by Christianity, not because Christianity showed itself to be big enough to include Platonism while remaining itself, but because it silenced its opponent. It literally just bullied it into silence. And I feel like the ideas speak for themselves. So, because of how Platonism was silenced, its material wasn't passed on appropriately. Only certain books were um, passed along. What am I trying to say? Recorded. There's another word for that I was looking for. Only some of its books were recorded and passed on by the monks, and those are the ones that the medieval thinkers had to work with. That's what they thought Platonism was. So I feel like of all of Plato's works, I feel like they only had the Timaeus, for example, Thomas Aquinas. He was missing so much of the Platonic corpus. Um, but nevertheless, the material that did survive throughout the ages provided thinkers, especially throughout the Middle Ages with the scholastics, and then on into the modern period and so forth. It provided them with questions about the big picture. Like, is there eternal life? How do we explain manyness? Are there forms of things? Are there forms of being? It inspired people, which I think is a testament to the vitality of the school of thought. But yeah, that's how I think Platonism was changed. Ultimately, it was bullied into submission, and then its systematic worldview was filtered very um, piecemeal.
Yeah. So did this lead to any sort of misconceptions or misinterpretations about Platonism from, I guess, the wider society?
Definitely, and here's just one example, because this is something that can be talked about all night, and especially by someone who's better informed than I am. I'm more of the philosophical side than the historical side, but here's just one example. The ancient Greeks were very comfortable using the word God not as a name for a singular, but as a description of a class of beings. So we might say, like, the human doesn't necessarily refer to, I'm not talking about a specific person, I'm just talking about people in general. I might say the human is an interesting animal. And I'm not actually saying there's someone out there named the human. So the Greeks used God like this a lot. When they would talk about God, they weren't talking about this one monotheistic deity. They were talking about anything insofar as it's a God, basically. And that way of using that term was ignored for a time, and then it was forgotten. And um, scholarship, even to this day, will still look back at ancient Greek authors like Aristotle and Plato and so forth, and they'll say, look, these guys are monotheists. It says right here that um, God did this, God did that, and it's such a anachronistic hermeneutic. But the reality is, it's a misunderstanding of these ancient thinkers. They weren't talking about an individual object. They were talking about a class of objects.
Absolutely. It sounds like it's like they're like, I don't know, forgetting the context of what it was written in and just completely forgetting, like, wait, when was this written? what
Hmm.
do these people think? Like it's just seems like it's like I don't know, looking at something and forgetting that wait, maybe we should look at this stuff in context.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So I was curious about should people who are interested in Platonism, like as polytheists, read these interpretations of Platonism that later monotheists did, or is that kind of a waste of time?
So I feel like there's value in all scholarship, and I don't want to, especially me, not a scholar myself. I don't want to tell people like censor work. You know what I mean? But what I will say is, I do believe that it's very clear how poorly Platonism has been represented by um, this monotheistic tradition. And you know something crazy? I went to seminary when I was in another lifetime, and I remember attending philosophy courses, and they would give us these textbooks with selections from pre-Socratics, from um, Plato, and so forth. And what's interesting is these selections that are provided in colleges and universities. These editions will cut out all the mentions that these authors had of other gods and their devotions, their practices, the recommendations, the all these things. So if you were to just go to college and take like an ancient philosophy course, you'd walk out of there thinking Plato didn't say a word about gods, you know. When in reality, if you had access to his full work, you'd see he talks about it all the time. Same with Aristotle, you know, and all these people. And so I feel like there is such a pervasive and grandfathered bias throughout scholarship that I would honestly take it with a grain of salt. But you can't get better than just reading the primary sources. So I would say if you're interested in reading about Plato, just read Plato and you'll see it for yourself. I mean, he talks about the gods all the time.
Yeah, I remember when I first came across this Platonic polytheism stuff. I knew Neoplatonism was relevant to all this because I see that term thrown around in Western esoteric literature all the time. But I didn't really take a look at it. I was just like, oh, okay, yeah, yeah, that's a term they use. But I remember I saw people discussing Platonic polytheism. I was like, wait, what? I didn't know why I didn't connect it. And then I look back at it and I was like, wait, yeah, I only did. You're right. I had a similar experience. I only read those selections, in school that are limited and restricted. And so I think a lot of people are surprised that all this stuff can be applied because one thing that I see in the modern pagan space a lot, and when I look at pagan discourse, when I interact in pagan communities, is I feel like we forget that there was a philosophic tradition before monotheism. And like the polytheistic space focuses so heavily just on mythos and, practices and all that, that they forget that, like, when we talk about and when we try to resurrect these traditions, there was a rich tradition of dialogue and philosophy that existed. And so a lot of these, like, theological questions that we're having, like we're reaching, because a lot of these debates are that they eventually come back to debates about theology, debates about philosophy. A lot of them could be explored and answered, well, not answered entirely because we're always going to have questions, you know what I mean, by
Mhm.
these philosophy schools that existed in the polytheistic world.
Yes, absolutely. Uh, the richness of a tradition, I think it goes back to like living out your ideas. Like whatever you think about the big questions of life, like are you able to live that out? And if I can just take this opportunity to kind of criticize the Platonic movement in
Oh yeah,
paganism.
I want to hear your critiques. I want to hear everything you have to say. What are your
Oh,
critiques of it?
okay, so you mentioned earlier how you've noticed, you might say, a surge in Platonic profession, right?
Yeah, I've noticed it particularly on Twitter for some reason, where there's like a lot of people who are calling themselves Platonist, Platonic polytheist, and they like will throw out Plato quotes and then post about the gods, pretty much.
Yeah, I feel like there is always a generation of people who are reacting to the religion that they were raised in, which in the Western world is very often Christianity. And I feel like Platonism affords people an impressive haven if they're running from a very, you might say, a controlling religion which told them all the answers. When you look at Platonism, you're like, wow, they have all these answers. They have this whole thing worked out, and so they run into this. And what I've noticed is there's some people who seem to have the same dogmatic mentality in Platonism that they, I guess, think they left behind in like Christianity or Islam or one of those more, you might say, controlling religions. And what I've been noticing, just as like a practicing Platonist, is that I don't think they're aware of um, that rich tradition of ancient Platonism, where it was a framework and a lifestyle. And the Platonists debated each other all the time about everything. They disagreed about everything. Like what united them was that framework, the one and the many, this overarching worldview. But the details, like you got to be kidding me, like they didn't agree on anything. So this idea, this newer generation, I'm seeing of Platonists who are like, I have all the answers. This is dogma, and they're like cramming Platonism down other pagans' throats. I'm like, this is not what it's about. You know what I mean?
That's really interesting because the reason that the Platonist thing I found interesting within the pagan space is because I felt like, and that makes sense. That reasoning makes actually a lot more sense because I have noticed people who are Platonist are kind of, that seems to just be their thing. Is it felt to me almost like a reaction to how in the wide pagan community, the mainstream pagan community, whatever you want to call it, it's a lot of people who are very practice oriented with little, I would say, ideological backing, right? You see people who are really, I guess, orthopraxic would be the word. Like they just kind of do things, they worship random gods, and they don't have that sort of orthodoxy at all to like this really, really extreme extent. And I was guessing that the Platonist thing was sort of a response to that and like a hey, let's have first principles thing. The way that you explain it makes a lot of sense as well because now I'm thinking back to sort of what I've read and what I've looked at in the Platonist pagan space, and I have noticed there is this rigidity to it. Um, that rigidity has a place. Um, there's I think that there's a problem with the absolute no orthodoxy thing. But if you become too orthodoxic, I think that's also a problem, right? Because personally, my view is the most important thing is your interaction with the gods and your spiritual development. That's where I stand. Not everyone will agree with me on that. And then, but beyond that, the orthodoxy, the theology, the reasoning, that does matter as well. So I do think you are kind of tapping into something with pointing out that that's a problem because I really think like we need balance in this regard, right? Like we need orthodoxy to some extent, right? We need principles, right? We need an understanding of something, otherwise the worldview is just incoherent and confusing. But we also do need that flexibility and that room for personal understanding and debate, right? I feel like any religious tradition that eliminates debate is kind of bound for failure because that's basically how you create a cult. Like pretty
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, it's definitely a recipe for a cult, one way or the other. And I feel like our community has seen extremes on both ends. You got the orthodoxy and the orthopraxy, the extreme versions of those, and the truth, as with all things, is somewhere in the middle. But I also think like along with you, I feel like the most important thing is your interactions with your God, your relationship with your God. I feel like however you articulate that is secondary, not of no importance, but it's secondary for sure. It's that relationship. If you don't have that, then what are you even doing? You know what I mean? Um, but I would say on the other hand too, like you can find your philosophical concepts in your religious tradition. Whereas I feel like what is sometimes happening with Platonists is they take the Platonic ideas and they try to um, use them almost like a religion. And they're like, I don't care if you're Norse or if you're Kemetic or if you're Hellenistic, whatever. Like you have to adhere to this. Platonic idea, this really controversial Platonic idea. Whereas I'm like, I feel like Platonism is bigger than that. You know what I mean? It should be like a framework that anyone can try to live the principles of. You know what I mean?
That's interesting because that was actually something I wanted to ask you. Most people who are Platonist are very much entrenched in the Hellenistic system, I've noticed.
Mm.
Can Platonism apply to other paganisms or other views?
Yes, absolutely. It is a theory of everything. It is a theory of the unity of reality. It is not um, a Greek theory, you might say. It was given to us by the Greeks, but you find its articulations across the globe. And um, in non philosophical terms, it's present in all religious experiences where people perceive their gods to be all things, to be almighty, to be everything. Like we're all grasping this from our own angles. But yeah, I would say for sure the Platonists, their principles are so universal that they're actually almost empty, and so they're like containers. They give us like the outer limits, and you can fill those with your tradition. You know, whether you're Norse or whatever. You know,
Interesting. Would that mean that like Platonism is in a sense kind of perennialistic?
by perennialistic, what do you mean?
I mean, like in the very broad sense, like the perennialist idea that all religions are different paths up the same mountain or sort of getting into the same inner truth. Obviously, perennialism can get into very specific things, but I just mean that very broad idea.
Okay, I only asked because I've heard of different descriptions of perennialism. One was that um, all philosophies kind of converge. I would say that the heart of Platonism is celebrating uniqueness, and in celebrating uniqueness, um, you find our commonality. Uh, so I would say that it is able to recognize the truth in each religion as pertaining to that religion's deities, for example. So all things converge on the one, you might say, but the one is each God in different respects.
Have, I guess, two final questions. The first would be if you could tell every polytheist one thing about Platonism, like one lesson they should take home, the one thing from Platonism they should internalize, what would that be?
Uh, to speak to polytheists in particular, I would say that um, your experiences of your God, of your gods, of your magic, of your tradition, all these things are valid. And there is a way to um, understand them in the big picture that may be of great interest to you. And that is given by the Platonists who um, developed these ideas over the course of centuries of very critical and sustained debate and investigation. And there's a whole school out there available to you if you're interested that could help make sense of your experiences. And yeah,
My final question is kind of a simple one. So, if someone wants to read Plato after listening to this, what should they read first? What is your advice?
I um, I think that will honestly depend on the person, where they're at in life, what they tend to enjoy. And I think that's the cool thing about Plato's dialogues is there's a little bit in there for everyone. And that format, that dialogue, even though it's written in old terms that may not be relatable entirely, the stories are entertaining. And I think it's been able to capture people's interest for so long because it kind of holds a mirror up to your own soul. And so I would say just pick up a collection of Plato's works. Maybe read through the descriptions, find one that interests you. There's, like I said, there's something in there for everybody.
Lovely. So, that's pretty much all I wanted to ask for this show. Where can people find you? Where's your corner on the internet? And where can people hear more of what you have to say?
So I would say, mostly active on Twitter. I guess I have my handle is true underscore consinity. But I also do run a blog I've done so a lot over the years, and my blogs come and go. But right now, I'm running the analyticpagan.com. That's really the only places I uh, publish like my philosophical works. Otherwise, you can find like my published works, such as Pagan Portals, Polytheism, a Platonic Approach, and that's available everywhere, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and all that. But as far as my online presence, I'm mainly just Twitter and my blog.
Perfect. And I'm your host, Georgina Rose. I continue to do this because of your support. You can find me on every platform in the entire world. I am on Instagram, Twitter, Telegram, TikTok, YouTube. That's my main thing. I'm a YouTuber. Um, and I do this show. I do this show every other week. If you want to support the show, you should join our Patreon. That is how I keep doing this and how I've been able to continue to make content for you guys and bring on new people. If you are a member of the Patreon, you get the pre-show, which is a little bonus mini show that I do before I have my guests jump on the call. You get extra episodes every pagan holiday. So that's every Wiccan Sabbath. I know not everyone likes the Sabbats, but it's an easy way for me to say every pagan holiday because everyone knows them. And the most important thing ever is you can get your name read off if you are a high enough patron and you opt in. I don't do everyone's name because I know some people like being anonymous, which is understandable. But if you are read off, I'm going to do that right now. Thank you so much for your support, and a special thanks to Kyle, Ruben, Trevino, Shiraz, Neva, Emily, Lilith, Jonah, Nauseated, and Lee. Thank you for your continued support. It means the world. You keep the lights on, so thank you for doing that. Um, if you are listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. If you are listening to this on a podcasting platform, please give us a review. The reviews make a big difference. Or if you're going to give it a bad review or you don't like the video, don't do anything because that in that case, just ignore. Anyways, thank you so much for listening, and we will be back in 2 more weeks. And have a lovely day, night, afternoon, mid morning, mid evening, wherever it is, wherever you are. All right, bye.